Okay, so we're going to talk about in chapter 8 about the idea of building an application using Excel as our foundation. All right, so we can a couple different ways to do this. Kind of the backstory on this is uh, Microsoft, when they were developing Excel, was really kind of aiming towards a target market where they would be they at the time a lot of what they were doing was based on the reality is they were the dominant desktop platform. So, and Microsoft Office was really kind of the driver on that. So what they had done was actually they had put a lot of work around this idea of using Office as an application, as an application platform, be able to develop custom applications using Microsoft Office as the foundation. So there's a lot of capability that's been baked into it. Now, what's happened over time is we've shifted from this idea of a desktop centric application to a network or internet based application. But still, the functionality that was added is still there, and we can still use Excel as a foundation to write some reasonably complex applications. So we're going to explore some of that in this particular chapter. So, so some of the stuff we're going to talk about something called formula precedence and dependence. We're going to talk about the evaluation of formulas. And we've talked about formulas up till now, and one of the things we've seen about one of the main characteristics are they can get pretty complicated when we add a lot of stuff to them in terms of addition, chaining multiple formulas together. And how do we figure out what's actually going on inside those formulas? We'll also talk a little bit about circular references, which are an Excel unique issue. Um, we'll describe the watch window, which is some additional functionality which will let us explore what's happening inside of our application inside of Excel. Um, also talk a little bit about, we'll talk about some of the capabilities that we've added into Excel for data validation. The idea of when you write an application, one of the important things that needs to go into that application is that the data, you add logic so you can verify that the data that is being brought into the program is correct. All right, so there's features that have been added to Excel that lets us do things like that. And then we'll talk about macros, or the programming language that's built into Excel, and how we can get to it. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a little bit of information about how do we navigate a workbook, as well as how do we protect workbooks and worksheets. Mm. So to start off with, let's talk about formula precedence and dependence. All right, so what a formula we've talked about formulas. We've talked about the ideas of arguments. Okay, there's arguments that go into a there's arguments that go into a formula, the execution of the formula. And depending upon the formula, we'll determine what are the correct attributes we need to submit. All right. Now, what happens is if we get a worksheet, we'll just take a look. Let's do an example here. We'll call up an example. And let me create a new, really simple blank workbook. All right. I can have, this is a trivial exercise. I'm going to put a value here. I'll put 5 here. I'll put 15 here. And what I want to do is I'll come down here and I'll say equals, create a formula, this plus this. All right, so 15 plus 5 equals 20. Okay. And we've also talked about, as we hover over, or as we, go to each individual cell so we can see what's in there. So these two have values. This one has a formula. All right. So, when I only have 3 values on a screen, it's pretty simple. But if I've got a more complicated formula, say multiple levels, multiple fields, multiple compound, with a lot of parentheses. kind of segmenting off the different pieces of a calculation. It's not that easy. It's not that easy to be able to figure some of this stuff out. Kind of what's going on. If you just pick up a worksheet, how do you figure out or be able to trace back what's going on? So what's been added to Excel is what we call the precedent tracing and dependent tracing. All right. So where we will find this at is this will be on the formula ribbon, tab on the ribbon. Okay. And we'll see over here, we see trace precedents, trace dependence. The way this works is we go to a cell that has a formula in it. All right. And if I click the precedents, what it'll do is it'll draw me the arrows of the cells that go into that formula, where they're at, and kind of where they kind of where they're at. So this is really simple. I have two, a simple formula, two values added together. All right. So when I click trace precedents on that, I can see what goes into it. Kind of a picture. And I can clear it up. Do the remove arrows. I'll take it away. So that's the precedent. So I can see what goes into this. I can see what makes up this formula here. All right. Now, a dependent is, if I take the value here and I say equal, we'll create another formula, equal this cell, and we'll say times 10. All right. So it's 200 times 10 is 20 times 10 is 200. Okay. If I do precedence, if I go to this formula and say dependence, so we saw what the precedents do. If I do dependence, what it'll do is it'll show me all cells in which this formula is present. So if I have another cell here, and I'll say equal times 20, and we'll do another one here just for funsies. Make that times 30. Okay, if I go to my formula here, I do trace dependence, it'll show me every place that this cell is referenced in all of these other formulas. All right, so it's really a simple mechanism that lets us trace what's going on, that we can get a better sense of, because what happens is when we look at Excel, we see the results of the execution of the formulas. So the challenge becomes one of, well, how do we get there? How, what makes that up? All right, so that is, so that's our, precedence and dependence. All right, so as we say here, this is on the ribbon, the formula ribbon, or formula tab on the ribbon, and trace precedence, trace dependence, remove arrows, and what we'll get is we will get an arrow every time we click it. Now obviously, if there is not a formula in that cell, there is no precedent. If it just says a value is a value. So it really depends upon the formula that's in the cell for that. All right, and then we'll as we kind of go through, we do the evaluation of a form. We'll kind of go through this. Now another thing we can do. Now this is a feature that is present in Excel for Windows, but not in Excel for Mac. All right, so I have Excel, I'm on a Mac, so I'm not going to be able to demonstrate it fully, but there is a feature, and where you would find it, if you look at it on the for Mac, it's actually in the same area here. It'll be like, evaluate formula. Right? And what you do, the mechanism it is, you click that cell with the formula, you click it, and it will give us a pop-up, and it'll let us step through the execution of that formula, okay, step by step. So we can do the evaluate, and then we can do one step at a time. I can work my way through the formula one step at a time. All right, so if I have multiple steps, as we talked about, as we saw, we can chain multiple functions into a formula. All right, especially if we're using ands and ifs, we're using these logical functions, the ands and ifs, and it will and it executes these functions one at a time. So this gives us the ability to kind of step through all of these component parts and see what's happening as we're going through. So this is the type of functionality we see if we're working with a higher level programming language like a Java or a Python. This will this will do a similar kind of functionality. So this is there's functionality in there called tracing, where I can execute as I'm executing the program. I can see what's going on inside the program. Where is it going? How the different logical functions are being evaluated. So this provides a kind of an Excel type of functionality, Excel's implementation of a trace. All right. Another thing is in Excel is something we call circular references. Right? So that's a kind of an Excel um, that is a Excel specific issue. All right. Now, what happens is we'll use this as our example. All right. We have a formula here, E4 plus N4, which is in this cell, and it looks, and that's fine. Now, what happens is if I were to add, so this is actually cell I19. All right. If I add the contents plus I19, all right. One of the things it's going to do, it's going to come up with a it's going to come up with a pop-up here. It says there are one or more circular references where a formula refers to its own cell either directly or indirectly, which cause them to calculate incorrectly. All right. So this is built-in feature. So the idea is that the expectation is that a cell will not reference itself when we're within a formula. All right. So if the formula contains a reference to itself, that they call that a circular reference. And if I do an OK, it'll give us the pop-up when I create it. And then what it'll do is it'll also, at the bottom of the screen, put a indication in there that I have a circular reference, and here is where it is located, which is I19. All right. Now, there are some rare situations where you might want to have a legitimate circular reference in your cell. For example, if you're trying to implement recursion, a formula using recursion where something will call itself again and again and again. That can be a situation where you might want to use that value. You might want to have a circular reference. But for the most part, circular references are usually, and are a mistake, where as you're entering the formula, you also include the address of that particular cell in the formula. But Excel is smart enough to identify it and pick it up and let us know where we've made this mistake. And then in addition, finally, we have what we call the watch window. So the watch window is kind of like, it's another tool similar to what we're doing with the evaluation of formula. But what it lets us do, it lets us monitor and trace what's going on inside the program, inside the execution of our formulas. So we can see these formulas can get really complicated. We had multiple levels, multiple tiers of logic in there. Alternate paths, ifs, ors. The idea of the watch window lets us monitor what's going on inside the cell. So at any given point in time, I can see, what's going on in the cell, what's the formula, and what's the evaluation of that formula as we go through, as we're checking. So we can see, for example, we have a tax calculation. So you have a sale price for something, and then you put tax on top of it. If the tax is not correct, what we can do is we can go back and create a watch window for that cell. Go through the execution, and then you'll see. You can kind of trace through as how that particular tax value is being calculated from the formula. All right. We can use and we can use the workbook that contains the cell must be open and remains open. And as soon as we close that workbook, all the cells, it will go away. Right. So that's kind of so these are kind of what we would consider programming types of functionality, the types of things an application developer using a higher level language, the same things, the same kind of tools that are in their toolbox are available inside of Excel. So let's take a look at the idea of data validation. So what data validation is all about is, as I said earlier, the idea is you want to verify, but if you have a program, it's interacting with a person, somebody. The expectation is somebody's going to enter information into into an application, and then they're going to do something with it. The weakest link in that is the person, right? Because people, are fallible. All right, they make mistakes. So if you can say, you need to enter a date in this field, somebody can enter ABC, right, which is obviously not a date. Um, or transpose digits, or you're supposed to put a decimal point, you don't put a decimal point, or any number of any number of things that could go wrong. So part of what we do in programming is we create logic, validation logic. All right, and what the validation logic will do, we'll take what is sent in and evaluate it against a set of rules. Is it this? Is it that? If it doesn't pass the criteria, we put a message back out on the screen saying, "Here, tell me you did this wrong. Correct it." All right. So it's because what happens is what will occur is if we are expecting a date and we get the letters ABC and we try to do a calculation, it will fail. Right? So, there are things we want to be able to head off. We want the program to be resilient. We want it to work. We want it to work correctly. Right? So by doing this control function, control data entry or evaluation of data entry, um, that's how we achieve this. All right. In Excel, there's one of the things that used to be, especially earlier versions of Excel, you know, you would, in order to do things like this, you would see people would create formulas that would do, evaluations. Okay, is something a date, or is something greater than this, or something less than that? Right? So what has occurred over time, what Microsoft has done is added the ability to create simple evaluation rules for data, into Excel. All right, so it's baked. That capability is baked into Excel. So how we get to that is, on our ribbon, we go to the Data tab. Right, if we take a look here, we have Data Validation. Right, and we do the pull down on that, and what we see is we have a couple different things here. Okay, a couple different things. Number one is this first entry is Data Validation. So this is where we create the rules. Right, and the idea is we can do, we have, different, by default right now is we can allow any value. Right, so that's so when we do that, everything's fine. We can enter a whole number, or a date. We can require it to be a date, and if it's a date, we can actually give it a range. All right. We can we can control the length. So if somebody's entering something into a cell, we can say, okay, a zip code should only be 5 characters long. All right. So if somebody enters 15, then we know it's not a zip code, and we can detect that and send a message back for somebody to correct it. All right. So there's a bunch of stuff we can do. So these are fairly simple rules. All right, nothing really super atomic powered about them, but it is a pretty valuable thing, especially when you're writing programs, to be able to have these things have a rule generator for us for all this. Now, the other things we can do from an interaction perspective, user interaction, we can establish an end. We can create an input message. So when somebody goes to that cell, you can get you'll get a display. When if you click that cell, it says enter this data, and with some with a title, and then with some level of detail about what you're looking for, what the expectations are, what you go into the cell. Right? And then in addition, finally, what we can do is we can determine if an error is detected to be able to send a message back. And we can also control what we are going to do. He's gone, so hopefully that'll be ended. So the error. So what will happen is we can say, if we detect invalidated, we can either say stop, right, which will actually give us a little iconish message. This will be attached to our message, which would be a red X circle, or I can make it a warning, which is a caution sign, or I can make it an informational. All right. And then in addition, I can also add a title, and I can add the error message. So if I say we should correct if something is expected to be a date, well, we can actually try it. So we can go here. Let me cancel this. I'm going to go to a cell here, and I'm going to create a data validation. All right. So my settings are, I'm going to require a text length of minimum is going to be 0. Actually, I can do an equal to 7. Okay, so so what I'm going to say is, I'll ignore a blank. All right, and then what will also want to do, I will also go back and say, advice, enter 7 digits. All right. And then say, please enter 7 digits. Okay. So validation, we're doing data validation here. So input message, enter. So this will prompt you when you come on. The error will be if we enter an error, we can give it a warning. We give it a warning, and we'll get okay. It needs to enter 7 digits. Okay, doing okay on that. All right. So if you see now, when we're on the field, it'll prompt it. If I try to put 8 in there, wrong length. So it'll prompt us. I can change that. So it will not let me. If I do 7, it works fine. If I do 2, it does not. You need to enter 7. So as you can see, this is just a way by which from a programming perspective, we can we can add programming like functionality without a lot of heavy lifting. Right now, we have the option in this. If we take a look at the in terms of the data validation. Yes. Okay. In terms of our data validation here, I can, as we can see, I can actually do a custom function, right? Custom function will allow us to put any formula we want in here. So, for example, when we were talking about a left justified numbers between certain ranges, anything we can define as an and or an or through an and or an or can be defined here. Okay, so we can use this. This is kind of the old way we would do it. We can use this as a means of being able to do this a little more simply. Okay, so that's our data validation. So let's look at. Oh, so let's take a look at as we're looking at this. So we're talking about the validation. So we're going through this. Is basically describes how we can use the data validation. So let's talk about macros. All right, so this is the honest to goodness programming side of Excel. All right, so as we, the couple of reasons we use macros. The idea is that we can program, we can repeat, we can capture our exact keystrokes to automate our tasks. So the idea is we get rid of the biggest problem in the whole, when you're working with a computer, is the person side. Right? They get rid of the human error. A couple of different ways we can do it. We can execute it by a worksheet button. It can also be done by a key combination. So let's take a look at macros in action. All right, we'll take our sheet here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new sheet. All right, and what I'm going to do in this sheet is I'm going to build out some data. I'm going to populate some cells. And the scenario is we want to populate this when somebody's working with a spreadsheet, this particular spreadsheet. We need to have this thing done to set up, repeat the same thing, all right, again and again and again. So let us take a look at a scenario. So where we get this at, where we get the macros at, all right, are going to be under the developer. And we talked about under the developer tab where this stuff is at. So the developer tab is where you have to go into the setup to get to the developer tab. So you have to go, it's a little bit different. Mine is under preferences on the Mac, but you have another setup on the ribbon and toolbar. And by clicking that, it'll turn the developers on. Okay, now once we have the developer ribbon tab up on the ribbon, then we have the ability to do stuff, right? So what I'm going to do is, we have a couple things here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to record a macro. All right, so this is very simple. All I do is I click record macro. It's going to ask me what I want the macro to be called. Where do I want to store it? I'm going to store it in this workbook. I can create a key, and I'm going to call it Control Command R. Doesn't like that? All right. You don't have to do a shortcut key. And this is going to be all right, so it's a demo of macros. That's what this is. This is a demo of a macro execution. So when I click this, oh, must be a letter. Okay. So here, what had happened was I actually had a blank in there. So it has to be a letter. And apparently you have to have a shortcut key. All right. So, okay, so right now I'm recording. So every stroke I put on the screen, everything I put on the screen is going to be recorded. So I'm going to create district 1, and we'll take it down to here. All right, district 27. So I populated that, and I'm going to do January through December. Okay, so I've created that, and I'm just going to put a number in here. We'll put 2, 4, 6. you should be smart enough to be able to pick up the pattern from here. Let's see. So fill it with our numbers. Fill series. All right, so it's smart enough. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's see, times equals this cell times 2 equals, let's say it's going to be this cell times 2, and so on and so forth. All right, so let's see what, if I populate this out. All right, and now I can grab that, pull this down. Oh. Nope, not quite. I think I have to do a little different. Anyway, so I'm going to create this. Well, actually, this will work too. All right, so, and then what I'm just going to do is I'm actually going to do a fill down of this. All right, so I've done a bunch of fills and I've done a bunch of things. All right, so you can see here my calculations. I've populated all this stuff out here. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to save that. So that's what we're going to do on this worksheet. So if I do a stop recording, the recording is now saved. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to execute it. All right, so let's go to another sheet, and we'll look at our macros, and we have a macro out here, macro 1. It's a demo of macro. If I click run, what it did is it took all of those keystrokes, all the stuff I had entered in, and it calculated. It actually converted all of what I was doing into Visual Basic code, which when I say click, it executes. All right. And to show you where this is at, if I go to my Visual Basic code and I go to modules on my workbook and module 1, this is the code which I automatically generated. So this is all captured all of my keystrokes and turned it into a program which we can run again and again and again. That's what the whole idea of a macro is. And then I can close this out just to show you. And then I can create a button. So I have these controls here. So if I go to controls, so I put a button here. Actually, let me put a button on the other screen. All right, so I'm going to create a button on this screen. Put it way out here. All right, so this is going to be button 1. And what I want button 1 to do is I'm going to want button 1 to I'm going to want this to, as the format. I'm going to do a format. I want to get to the code behind it. No, all right. I'll do. When in doubt in these situations, we'll just delete it. All right, let me do this. Because now I'm stuck in that between two things here. So let me do a cut. So it's gone. All right. So I'm going to re-add that button. All right. I'm going to click it here. Click a button. I'm going to put it here. And it's going to ask me what I want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say run macro 1. So when I click the button, it's going to run macro 1. I'm going to do it OK. Actually, it says it's really button 2 because I deleted button 1. If I run this, if I click it, so it's connected. All right. So the whole idea is that with macros you can record these things and replay code. Now the problem is with macros are they are really considered insecure. All right? So what happened was when Microsoft developed them, hackers figured out that, well, if I can get into a worksheet and I can get them to run some code, I can take over the machine. So this was a big issue, all right, with in Microsoft and in anybody running Excel. So one of the things Microsoft has done is, number one, if I try to save this, there's some macros in this. If I try to save this file, all right, so it'll prompt me, give a name. I'm just going to call it Book 1. But what it'll do is it'll come up with a message saying, "Hey, you've got a VB project in here. You got a Visual Basic project in this worksheet." All right. So what happens is if in order to save this, I have to save it as a macro-free. Um, I have to save this as a macro-free workbook. All right. Not. Uh, so the idea is that when you're using macros, you want to be sure that you're not you know, you, you're aware of the security implications of running a macro. If somebody gets hold of your machine or somebody's able to get you to open something up and you're running macros, in a worksheet, potentially your machine could get compromised. All right, it's a well-known, it's a funny thing. It's been around like 20 years, and people still get burned on it. So, okay, so that is macros, right? And that is the programming language that's inside. Now you can actually go back if you're feeling particularly enthusiastic. You can go back into the Visual Basic, and you can write your own programs from the ground up. All right, so it's a very functional, a lot of capabilities built into this. All right. All right, so this is just basically the exercise we had just gone through: creation and use of macros. We kind of go through this, you click the developer button or insert button on the developer tab. There's just a couple, we're recovering steps. All right. And actually, the thing that's interesting is if you make an error, one of the things you can do is you can actually go back and you have a choice. You can either just go back and re-record the macro, or you can go back and edit it, make the changes there. All right. So a couple of things. So that is really, basically what we need to know about macros, the programming language that's built into Excel or Visual Basic. A couple other things that were in, that they talk about in the chapter dealing with, workbooks and the programmability of workbooks is, the world right now has moved from kind of desktop applications to web-based applications. So this idea of using hyperlinks, using internet-type communication as the means to operate within a workbook is functionality that's in Excel now. So we can actually create hyperlinks, and we can go either to a worksheet, a workbook, other files out to the internet. Go to emails, generate, do web pages. Anything we can do with a hyperlink can be done done inside of an Excel workbook. All right. And once again, this is part of this is the fact that Microsoft has added this capability primarily because we live in an internet-based world. All right. So Microsoft understands that, so they're kind of following along that path. A couple other things, how you can hide worksheets. One of the things we had talked about this earlier. If, for example, we have a worksheet, it's like, for example, if we have a worksheet that has data in it that drives the rest of, that really kind of drive calculations and formulas and things like that. All right. If we have something like that, we might want to do something like hide the worksheet so it doesn't get edited, because if it gets edited, if it's critical information, it drives, calculations and formulas, and it gets edited, it's not good. So we can hide it. We can hide, worksheets. We can hide the tabs. Um, it'll actually, we can use this. We can, we have a couple of options we can work with around hiding worksheets. We can also hide, scroll bars. So say, for example, here, the case we run into a lot is that you send worksheets out to people, and what they'll do is, say, for example, the stuff is on the screen, on your first screen, and what they'll do is they'll pull it down like about 80 rows down to the bottom of the, they'll pull like 80 rows down. So when you open the worksheet, you don't see any of the data. The data is there. You have to scroll back up. Get around that. You just simply hide the scroll bars. Keep people from doing stuff. All right. Protection, kind of similar. You can hide it or you can protect it. We have all sorts of options. We have all sorts of options around that. We can set this up so we can protect it using, passwords. We can lock the structure of the workbook, or or we can do, we can mark the workbook as final. Now, the thing about final is, these are different degrees of, different ranges of stuff. Okay, so for example, if you mark a workbook as final, all it does is it gives an informational message saying that somebody made this workbook final. That does not mean you can't get to it. Obviously, if you put a password on it, you have to have the password. All right. So as we move this up, as we look at the options we have is on a worksheet, we can protect the worksheet, protect everything on the worksheet, and then come back in, and adjust what we want to be able to touch here. So we can do that. Once again, the protect workbook button is, if you look on a worksheet, we will see it under review. All right, so if you go to the review tab on the ribbon, what you'll see is a protect worksheet and protect workbook. All right. So we can protect the structure, we can protect the windows. And this is really, if we're in, say, a collaborative environment, people are using the same, sharing the same worksheet, so we can, but we don't want people messing with it. Right? And that's a real life situation. A couple other odds and ends here. So we talked about we can protect the entire work. We can protect it at the worksheet. We can protect it at the workbook level. We mark it as final. As we said, all final does is it puts up a warning message that it's, this is this is final, and then there's a button, and we can click it right away and say, yeah, it's somebody marked it as final, but you want to change it. So that's kind of what this message says. Edit it anyway. So obviously there's not a lot stopping someone from actually touching and working with it. So a quick summary of what we talked about in this chapter. So we talked about the idea of identifying precedence and dependence in a formula. Be able to look at the execution of a formula step by step, so we can walk our way through it. Trace precedence, so we can identify. We can also do things to identify circular references. So Excel, circular references is a cell that has a formula that references itself. All right, which it'll detect it and it'll alert it at the bottom of the screen. And then we can also make changes, a few changes to cells with what we call the watch window. The watch window and the evaluate formulas functionality are resident in Windows version of Excel, not in the Mac version of Excel. We can do, there's functionality in Excel that lets us do data validations. We can do validations of the cell. we can, drop down list of choices. We can use macros. We can put macros in there to automate tasks. Assign it to buttons on the screen. And then we also have the ability to hide worksheets. We can use hyperlinks, to allow people to navigate through it. We can hide the vertical scroll bars, hide the worksheets, hide the tabs. So this is all around this idea of creating an application and then making it, usable over time. All right. And then finally, from restrictions, we protect workbooks, prevent changes. Only allow certain cells and ranges to be modified, or we can check that we can restrict access by a password. The one thing to remember: the highest level of control that we can assign to a workbook is by encrypting it. Right? When we encrypt it, it will actually protect it. It'll translate all of the stuff to an unreadable format, which can be reversed so long as you have the key. All right, but that is the highest level. So in Excel, a workbook, an encrypted workbook, is protected if somebody steals the workbook or somebody steals the laptop, steals the workbook. They can't get to it unless they have the key. All right. That wraps it up for Chapter 8.